But instead of having a mandate and a charter that encompasses the kinds of things we are talking about in terms of move towards a sustainable economy, accountable to communities, much more local participation in decision-making in the operations of corporations, all of that calls for a whole overhaul of the operations of corporations. And what we're seeing in some parts of the world today is a move towards some alternatives on both these fronts. In the case of the corporation, we are seeing many local communities in the United States, for example, beginning to engage in a process of rechartering corporations. And what they're saying is that if a company comes in and it's going to do damage to the community says, we don't want that corporation in this community. For example, hog farm corporations have been tossed out and turfed out of a number of local communities. A number of big water-guzzling corporations like Nestle's and so forth have been challenged and in some cases turfed out of the community because local communities have organized through their governments to stop this from happening. And we're also seeing some real questioning beginning to take place with regards to the stock market. Can you imagine what would happen if the stock market didn't simply award corporations in terms of their financial responsibility to their shareholders and holding them accountable in terms of simply financial liability as far as their shareholders are concerned? But what would happen if there was environmental liability and social liability built into the operations of the stock market? What kind of revolutionary changes could take place as a result of that as well? If we look at the role of the state in this regard, what we're seeing, again, the emphasis is on local governments, but if we go to the UK today, we will find in several communities something called town transition or transition towns. And those transition towns have gotten all the stakeholders together in a given community in a given locale with the local government, and they've decided to move from an industrial model to a more sustainable model of the economy. And this is the kind of transition and change that's been taking place with regards to those kinds of operations. Let me bring it back, however, to national governments and to recognize that if we talk about the role of the state and we talk about national governments, obviously national governments are going to eventually have to play a real role in this. I want to bring you to what is happening very briefly in Ecuador these days. In both Ecuador and Bolivia, as you know, new governments have taken shape and form, and those new governments are largely the reflection of indigenous populations. In the case of Ecuador, what's happened is that the indigenous population has really pushed for radical changes in both the constitution of Ecuador as a country and also in terms of its operations in the oil patch and the oil field. In terms of the constitution, what they have done and are in the process of doing is enshrining the rights of nature into the Constitution. So it starts to govern and reframe all laws and ways of operating in the country. Secondly, there are a group of indigenous peoples there whose land is on oil-bearing land, and they have come to the conclusion collectively that they don't want the oil taken up from the ground, because to get at the oil that is underneath them will require enormous environmental damage. And so they have said to their government, we want you to negotiate with other governments around the world and say, in the light of climate change and the light of global warming, we will not take this oil out of the ground, but we will leave it in the ground, and we want to be compensated for that because that's a contribution to the survival of the planet. And they've taken this proposal to the United Nations, and it is a part of a current process that's undergoing there at the present time. These are significant shifts that you would not normally see, and rethinking of the role of governments and in relationship to the issues that we have been talking about. In terms of the Canadian challenges that I think we face as a result of what's going on. We are a country that does have a fair amount of oil that is being produced and extracted, and we are a country that also has a fair amount of fresh water sources. And so the question that we are faced with today is, how are we going to focus in on these two resources, and how are we going to manage them in relationship to the triple crisis that we've been talking about? We have a fair amount of oil and natural gas in this country, especially as a result of what we have seen with the Athabasca or Alberta tar sands. That's the largest, perhaps the largest hydrocarbon deposit discovered on the planet. And at the same time, it is unconventional oil in the sense that just to get at that oil, we burn a great deal of what is a relatively clean fossil fuel, and that's natural gas, to extract the oil from the bitumen. We also use an enormous amount of water, something like 4 to 5 barrels of water for every barrel of oil taken out of the tar sands. And as a result, we are really we're really pushing the limits again of nature with regards to getting access to that oil. And so we've done it because there's a huge market for it. There's a huge market for it to the south. It is now somewhere around 2 million barrels a day. It is to go, the expectation is that that will rise to 5 or 6 million barrels a day by the year 2020. We are by far the largest and will continue to be the largest importer to the United States. Do we start to move in the direction of bulk water exports to the United States and create a whole new revenue stream for this country as a result of that? Or do we start to develop a strategy in which the water we do have is used as a leverage to really promote serious water conservation and also to bring us more and more into a more sustainable model of development? There is a person by the name of Richard Heinberg who has written a great deal about the peak oil issues and has come to a set of propositions where he says that what we need today is an oil depletion protocol. We need to start putting a cap on oil production and to start sharing that oil produce in a much different way in the world. And we need to create an oil production and an oil depletion protocol. And in many ways, you could still apply this with regards to the question of exercising leverage. What he says is that if we're going to move to sustainable economies, we've got to ration the oil that we have. We've got to redistribute that oil in a different way, in a more equitable way, and we've got to move and force the economic and political levers in the direction of a more sustainable economy. And we could be thinking about what it would mean for us to have a water depletion protocol and to start using the water that we do have in a much more strategic way to move us and as leverage to move us in the direction of a more sustainable economy and towards serious water conservation practices that are going to be absolutely crucial. An oil depletion protocol or a water depletion protocol simply would not be possible in present circumstances between Canada and the United States. Why? Because of NAFTA. Because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, because of the proportional sharing clause that exists in the NAFTA and exists in the original Free Trade Agreement between Canada and the United States, this unusual commitment that was made, or sellout that was done on the part of Canadians as a part of the Free Trade Agreement, is there as a major blockage, a major block. And that block will have to be removed if we are in any way going to move in the direction that we're talking about here.